The gunshot that shattered the dawn silence sent Faith Coleman scrambling from her tent into the frozen wilderness of the Colorado Rockies. Her supplies scattered behind her, her horse spooked into the darkness, and her hands trembling so violently she could barely grip the matchbox that might save her life. November of 1882 had brought an early winter to these mountains, and the outlaws who had just raided her camp left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need for warmth before the cold claimed what bullets had not. Faith crouched beside the ring of stones she had frantically assembled, her fingers fumbling with matches that kept slipping from her grasp. Each failed attempt sent another precious match tumbling into the dirt, and tears of frustration froze on her cheeks as the mountain wind bit through her thin traveling dress. She had been 3 days out from Denver, heading toward the mining camps where her brother worked, carrying the deed to their father's claim and enough money to stake a proper operation. Now the money was gone, the deed was gone, and if she did not get warm soon, her life would be gone too. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze, terror flooding through her veins. Were the outlaws coming back? Her shaking intensified until she dropped the entire matchbox, the remaining matches spilling across the frozen ground. She scrambled to gather them with numb fingers, her breath coming in panicked gasps that created clouds of vapor in the frigid air. "Easy now!" a deep voice called out, and Faith's head snapped up to see a rider approaching slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I heard the shooting. Are you hurt?" The cowboy sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy coat, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat in the gray pre-dawn light. Faith tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. She shook her head instead, still clutching the scattered matches in her frozen hands. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground as he approached. "Let me help you with that fire before you freeze to death out here." His voice was gentle despite its roughness, the kind of voice that had talked down frightened horses and calmed spooked cattle through countless long nights on the range. Faith wanted to protest, wanted to say she could manage on her own, but another violent shiver robbed her of speech. She watched through blurred vision as the cowboy knelt beside her carefully constructed fire ring, his movements efficient and practiced. He produced a tin of matches from his coat pocket and struck one against a stone. The flame caught immediately, and he held it steady against the kindling she had gathered, coaxing the fire to life with the patience of a man who had spent years living under open sky. The flames grew, spreading warmth and light into the cold morning, and Faith felt tears of relief spill down her frozen cheeks. The cowboy fed larger pieces of wood into the fire, building it up until heat radiated in waves that made her fingers tingle painfully as sensation returned to them. "Thank you," she finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and broken. He settled back on his heels and tipped his hat back, revealing a strong-jawed face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of storm clouds that held both kindness and careful wariness. "Thomas Sterling," he said. "I have a camp about a mile south of here. I was checking my traps when I heard those shots." "What happened?" Faith wrapped her arms around herself, edging closer to the blessed warmth of the fire. "3 men. They came just after dawn, took my horse, my money, everything. I am Faith Coleman, and I was traveling to the mining camps near Leadville to find my brother." Thomas's expression darkened. 3 men on horseback, one riding a paint horse, another on a gray? "Yes," Faith said, surprise cutting through her misery. "You know them?" "The Garrett gang," Thomas said grimly. "They have been working these mountains for the past month, preying on travelers. The law has not been able to catch them because they know every trail and hiding spot in these hills." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her inadequate clothing and lack of supplies. "You cannot stay out here alone. It is 30 miles to Leadville, and the temperature will drop below 0 tonight. Come back to my camp. I have food and blankets, and we can figure out what to do. Come morning." Faith knew she should be cautious about accepting help from a strange man in the wilderness, but the alternative was freezing to death before noon. Thomas Sterling had kind eyes, and he had helped her when he could have just ridden past. Sometimes survival meant taking calculated risks. "I do not want to impose," she said carefully. Thomas stood and offered his hand to help her up. "It is not imposing if I am offering. Besides, my mother would rise from her grave to haunt me if I left a lady to freeze in the mountains." His slight smile took the edge off the grim joke, and Faith found herself smiling weakly in return. She took his hand, feeling the callous strength of his grip as he pulled her to her feet. Her legs nearly buckled, stiff from cold and shock, but Thomas steadied her with a hand on her elbow. He kicked dirt over her fledgling fire, then walked her to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding that stood patient and calm. "Can you ride?" Thomas asked. "I have been riding since I was 6, Faith said, though her current state probably made that hard to believe. Thomas swung into the saddle and reached down for her. Faith grasped his forearm and let him pull her up behind him, settling onto the horse's back with her arms wrapped around Thomas's waist for balance. The warmth of another human being after the terror of the morning nearly undid her completely, and she had to fight back a sob as they started moving through the pine forest. Thomas's camp was tucked into a sheltered hollow, where a small creek ran between banks lined with frost. He had erected a sturdy canvas tent, and a proper fire pit ringed with stones sat before it. He dismounted and helped Faith down, then guided her to sit on a log near the fire ring, while he rebuilt the fire with the same practiced efficiency he had shown before. Once flames were crackling steadily, he disappeared into his tent and emerged with a heavy wool blanket that he draped around Faith's shoulders. The weight and warmth of it made her sigh with relief. He hung a pot of water over the fire to boil, then set about preparing coffee with movements that spoke of long routine. "How long have you been in these mountains?" Faith asked, watching him work. Speaking helped push back the lingering fear and cold. "About 3 months now," Thomas said, measuring coffee grounds into a battered tin pot. "I have been trapping beaver and marten, gathering pelts to sell in Denver come spring. It is solitary work, but it suits me." "You live up here alone all winter?" The thought seemed impossibly lonely to Faith, who had grown up in a bustling household in Kansas before her father had been struck with gold fever and moved them west. "Mostly," Thomas said. He set the coffee pot on a flat stone near the fire's edge, where it would heat slowly. "I head down to the trading post in Granite every few weeks for supplies and to check for mail. But yes, it is just me in the wilderness most of the time." He glanced at her, those storm-gray eyes assessing. "I expect that sounds strange to a city woman." "I am not exactly a city woman," Faith said. "I grew up in El Dorado, Kansas. It was a small town, nothing like Denver or Kansas City. I know how to work hard and make do with less." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Though I admit, I have never spent a winter in mountains like these." Thomas poured coffee into 2 tin cups once it had finished brewing, handing one to Faith. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully, letting the heat seep into her stiff fingers. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it spread warmth through her chest and belly. "Tell me about your brother," Thomas said, settling onto another log across the fire from her. "What is he doing in Leadville?" "Matthew is working a claim our father staked before he died last year," Faith explained. The familiar grief rose up, but she pushed it down to focus on the story. "Father was convinced there was silver in those mountains, spent everything we had on the claim and equipment. He died of pneumonia last winter before he could really start working it. Matthew went out in the spring to honor Father's dream, but he has not had much luck. I was bringing him the deed and some money I saved from working as a seamstress in Denver. I thought if we sold the claim, at least we could recover something and start over somewhere warmer. But now the deed is gone," Thomas said quietly. Faith nodded, blinking back tears. "The outlaws took my satchel. Everything was in it. Without that deed, Matthew has no legal right to the claim. Someone else could file on it, and we would have nothing to show for all Father's sacrifice." Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Then he said, "The Garrett gang has a hideout somewhere in these mountains. I have been trying to find it for weeks. They robbed a prospector I had befriended back in September, killed him when he fought back. His name was Charlie Henderson, and he was a good man who never hurt anyone. I swore I would see them brought to justice." Faith looked at him with new understanding. "That is why you are really up here, not just trapping." "The trapping is real enough," Thomas said. "I need to make a living, and pelts bring good money. But yes, I have been tracking the Garretts whenever I find their trail. So far they have stayed one step ahead of me." He met her gaze across the fire. "If I can find their hideout, I can get your deed back, and I can make sure they answer for what they have done." "That sounds dangerous," Faith said. "There are 3 of them." "I have faced worse odds," Thomas said, though there was no bravado in his voice, just a quiet statement of fact. "But I will not do anything foolish. First priority is getting you safe and warm. Then we will worry about the Garretts." They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and letting the fire's warmth drive the last of the cold from Faith's bones. The sun was fully up now, filtering through the pine branches in golden shafts. Birds called in the distance, and somewhere a creek babbled over stones. It should have been peaceful, but Faith could not shake the memory of gunfire and rough hands grabbing her belongings. Thomas eventually stood and pulled supplies from his tent, setting about making a simple breakfast of salt pork and beans. Faith watched him cook, noting the economical way he moved, the quiet competence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin and his own company. He was probably close to her age, maybe 25 or 26, with the lean build of someone who worked hard and ate sparingly. There was something inherently trustworthy about him, a steadiness that made her feel safer than she had since leaving Denver. They ate sitting by the fire, and Thomas did not press her with questions or unwanted conversation. Faith appreciated that. The food settled her stomach, and with warmth and safety restored, exhaustion crept over her. She must have swayed where she sat, because Thomas reached out to steady her. "When did you last sleep?" he asked. "I have been traveling for 3 days," Faith admitted. "I wanted to reach Leadville as quickly as possible. I slept a few hours each night, but not much." "You need proper rest," Thomas said firmly. "Take my tent. I will keep watch and make sure nobody bothers you." Faith wanted to protest, but another wave of exhaustion washed over her, and she realized he was right. She could barely keep her eyes open. "Where will you sleep?" "I will be fine," Thomas said. "I have slept in worse places than beside a fire. Go on now, before you fall over." Faith allowed him to guide her into the tent, where he had already laid out bedrolls and blankets. The space smelled of canvas and wood smoke and leather, distinctly masculine but not unpleasant. She collapsed onto the bedding, and Thomas draped another blanket over her. "Sleep as long as you need," he said quietly. "You are safe here." Faith wanted to thank him, wanted to say something about his kindness, but sleep pulled her under before she could form the words. She woke to the sound of voices outside the tent. For a moment, panic seized her, memories of the morning's attack flooding back. But then she recognized Thomas's calm baritone and another voice, older and rougher. Afternoon light filtered through the canvas, suggesting she had slept for several hours. Faith emerged from the tent to find Thomas talking with a grizzled man who sat astride a mule, a pack laden with furs strapped behind him. Both men looked up as she appeared. "Miss Coleman," Thomas said. "This is Jack Winters. He is a trapper who works these mountains. I was just telling him about your trouble with the Garretts." Jack Winters was probably 60 years old, with a white beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen decades of wilderness living. He tipped his battered hat to Faith. "Sorry to hear about your misfortune, miss. The Garretts are a plague on these mountains. I have been saying for months that someone needs to deal with them permanent-like." "Jack might have information that could help us," Thomas said. "He has seen tracks near the old abandoned mining camp up by Timberline Lake. Thinks the Garretts might be holed up there." "It would make sense," Jack said. "That camp has been empty for 5 years, since the mine played out. There are a couple of sturdy cabins still standing, and it is remote enough that most folks do not go up there. If I was an outlaw, that is where I would hide." Faith felt a surge of hope. "Could we get there before dark?" "It is a hard ride, especially with the trail covered in snow," Jack said. "But if you left at first light, you could make it by noon." He looked at Thomas. "You planning to go after them alone, boy?" "I do not have much choice," Thomas said. "By the time I could ride to Granite and fetch the marshal, the Garretts could be long gone." "I will ride with you," Jack said. "I owe Charlie Henderson too. He was my friend for 20 years. Thomas nodded slowly. "I would appreciate that, but Miss Coleman stays here where it is safe." Faith opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She wanted her deed back desperately, but she also had no weapons, no horse, and no experience with gunfights. She would be a liability, not a help. As much as she hated to admit it, Thomas was right. "I will stay," she said quietly, "but please be careful. That deed is not worth anyone else dying." Thomas met her gaze, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding and shared concern that made Faith's heart skip strangely in her chest. "We will be careful," he promised. Jack stayed for another hour, discussing routes and strategies with Thomas while Faith listened and tried not to let her fear show. Eventually, the old trapper departed, promising to return at dawn to begin the journey to Timberline Lake. As evening fell, Thomas cooked another simple meal, and they ate while darkness gathered under the pines. The temperature dropped sharply once the sun set, and Faith huddled close to the fire, grateful for the blankets Thomas had provided. "Tell me about Kansas," Thomas said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "What was El Dorado like?" Faith smiled, remembering home. "It was a cattle town, wild and rowdy when the herds came through. My father ran a general store on Main Street. We sold everything from penny candy to plow blades. Matthew and I grew up helping in the store, learning to keep accounts and deal with cowboys and farmers alike." Her smile faded. "Then Father heard about the silver strikes in Colorado. He sold the store, packed up everything we owned, and moved us to Denver, said he was going to make our fortune." "But he did not," Thomas said gently. "No, he spent 2 years chasing rumors and filing claims that never panned out. The pneumonia took him last January, and Mother followed him in March. Broken heart, the doctor said, though I think it was more that she had given up." Faith stared into the flames, old grief settling heavy in her chest. "Matthew and I are all that is left of the Coleman family now." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My family is all gone too. Parents died of cholera when I was 16, took my little sister too. I have been on my own since then, working cattle drives, mining camps, whatever paid enough to keep me fed and moving." "That sounds lonely," Faith said softly. "It has been," Thomas admitted. "But I learned to be self-sufficient, learned not to depend on anyone or let anyone depend on me. It seems safer that way." Faith understood that impulse, the desire to protect yourself from further loss by keeping the world at arm's length. But it also seemed like a terribly sad way to live. Before she could say so, Thomas stood and added more wood to the fire. "You should get some more rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day of waiting, and you will want your strength." Faith wanted to keep talking, wanted to learn more about this quiet cowboy who had saved her life with simple kindness, but exhaustion was creeping over her again. She retired to the tent, burrowing into the blankets that still smelled of leather and wood smoke. Sleep came quickly, but her dreams were troubled, filled with gunshots and cold wind and storm-gray eyes that watched over her with unexpected tenderness. Dawn broke cold and clear, the sky a pale blue that promised fair weather. Faith woke to find Thomas already up, checking his rifle and packing supplies into his saddlebags. He moved with quiet purpose, his expression serious and focused in a way that made Faith's stomach clench with worry. Jack Winters arrived as promised, his mule loaded with gear and his own rifle prominently displayed in his saddle scabbard. The two men conferred in low voices while Faith made coffee, her hands steadier than they had been the previous morning, but her heart racing with anxiety. Thomas came to her as he was preparing to mount up. He looked different somehow, harder and more dangerous than the gentle man who had lit her fire and made her breakfast. The transformation was unsettling. "Stay in camp," he instructed. "Keep the fire going and do not wander off. If we are not back by dark, head south toward Granite. It is about 15 miles. You should be able to walk it in a day." "You will be back," Faith said, with more confidence than she felt. She reached out impulsively and caught his hand. "You have to be. I never properly thanked you for saving my life." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, and some of the hardness left his expression. "Save your thanks until we have your deed back," he said, but his fingers squeezed hers gently before he let go and swung into his saddle. Faith watched them ride out, disappearing into the pine forest as the sun climbed higher. Then she was alone with the crackling fire and her worried thoughts. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Faith kept herself busy gathering firewood, boiling water for coffee, and attempting to repair a tear in her dress with a needle and thread she found in Thomas's supplies. But her mind kept drifting north, imagining what might be happening at Timberline Lake. Thomas and Jack were experienced men, she told herself. They knew these mountains and knew how to handle themselves. They would be fine. They had to be fine. But worry gnawed at her nevertheless, sharpened by the memory of gunshots and the knowledge that the Garrett gang had already killed at least once. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent. Faith paced the camp, unable to settle. She had known Thomas Sterling for less than a day, yet the thought of him being hurt or killed made her chest tight with an emotion that went beyond simple gratitude. He had been kind when he could have been indifferent, gentle when he could have been callous. In a hard world that had taken so much from her, his unexpected compassion had touched something deep in her heart. Please let him be safe. She prayed to whatever powers might be listening. Please let them both come home. The afternoon wore on. Faith built up the fire against the gathering cold, wrapped herself in blankets, and tried not to imagine the worst. The sun touched the western peaks, painting them gold and crimson, and still there was no sign of the men. Then, as the light was fading toward dusk, she heard hoofbeats. Faith scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. 2 riders emerged from the trees, one on a buckskin gelding and one on a mule, and relief flooded through her so powerfully her knees went weak. Thomas and Jack rode into camp, looking weary but triumphant. Thomas dismounted and immediately came to Faith, pulling her battered satchel from his saddlebag and handing it to her. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, and there was satisfaction in his voice despite his obvious exhaustion. Faith opened the satchel with shaking hands. Everything was there, the deed to her father's claim, the money she had saved, even the small daguerreotype of her parents she had tucked into an inner pocket. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." "Do not thank us yet," Jack said, climbing stiffly off his mule. "We have got 3 prisoners tied up about a mile back. We need to get them to the marshal in Granite, and that means a long, cold ride tomorrow." Faith looked up sharply. "You caught them, all 3? "We caught them," Thomas confirmed. "They were holed up in those old mine buildings just like Jack thought. We watched them for a couple hours to get the lay of things, then moved in when they were distracted with drinking and playing cards. Jack came in from the east while I came from the west. We had them disarmed before they knew what was happening." "Nobody got hurt?" Faith asked anxiously, studying Thomas for signs of injury. "A couple bruises and one of the Garretts took a bullet in the shoulder when he tried to draw on Jack, but nothing serious," Thomas said. "They are secured for now, but we need to get them to proper law as soon as possible." Jack was already building up the fire. "We will camp here tonight, move out at first light. It is too dangerous to travel with prisoners after dark." The 3 of them worked together to prepare for the night. Jack rode back to collect the prisoners, bringing them into camp, tied securely on their own horses. The Garrett gang proved to be 3 rough-looking men in their 30s, sullen and silent now that they had been caught. Thomas tied them to trees at the edge of the camp, where they could be watched but not interfere. Dinner was a celebratory affair, despite the prisoners' presence. Jack produced a bottle of whiskey from his saddlebags and poured a measure into everyone's coffee. They ate beans and biscuits and toasted Charlie Henderson's memory. "He would have been pleased to know we got them," Jack said, raising his cup. "Charlie always said justice might be slow, but it was sure." Faith found herself sitting close to Thomas as the evening deepened, drawn to his warmth and his quiet presence. He had risked his life to recover her stolen property, and the magnitude of that gift was only now truly hitting her. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly when Jack had moved off to check on the prisoners. "You did not know me. You did not owe me anything." Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he said, "Maybe because someone should have helped my mother when she was traveling alone with 2 kids and desperately needed it. Nobody did, and she barely survived the journey to California. I have always remembered how scared she was, how alone." He looked at Faith, his gray eyes reflecting firelight. "When I saw you this morning, shaking so hard you could not light that fire, I saw my mother. I saw someone who needed help and deserved to receive it. I could not ride away from that." Faith felt something shift in her chest, a warming that had nothing to do with the fire. "Your mother would be proud of you," she said softly. "I hope so," Thomas said. "She was a good woman who deserved better than what life gave her." They sat together in comfortable silence, shoulders nearly touching, and Faith realized she did not want this journey to end. The thought of reaching Granite, of saying goodbye to Thomas Sterling and continuing on to Leadville alone, filled her with unexpected sadness. But she could not ask him to abandon his life and his work to accompany her further. She had no claim on him beyond one day of kindness. When they reached civilization, they would part ways, and that would be that. The thought kept her awake long after she had retired to the tent, staring up at the dark canvas and listening to Thomas moving around the camp, keeping watch over their prisoners and their fire. Morning brought fresh snow, light flurries that dusted the pine branches and made the world look clean and new. They broke camp efficiently, and the journey to Granite began, with Faith riding behind Thomas once more, and Jack leading the 3 prisoners on a rope line behind his mule. The trail was difficult, narrow and steep in places, and the going was slow. But Thomas proved to be an expert horseman, guiding his buckskin gelding with confidence even over treacherous ground. Faith held on to him, acutely aware of the strength in his back and the steady rhythm of his breathing. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat a cold meal. The prisoners complained constantly, but Jack ignored them with the ease of long practice. Faith watched Thomas check the cinches on his saddle and refill his canteen from a creek, memorizing the way he moved, the line of his jaw, the serious set of his mouth. She was falling in love with him. The realization came quietly, without drama, but with absolute certainty. Somewhere between fire and kindness and quiet conversations under the stars, Faith had given her heart to this gentle cowboy who lived alone in the mountains. The knowledge was both wonderful and terrible, because she knew there was no future in it. They reached Granite just as the sun was setting, riding into a rough mining town that clung to the mountainside like a stubborn growth. False-fronted buildings lined a single muddy street, and the sound of piano music drifted from several saloons. Jack led them directly to the marshal's office, a squat building with barred windows and a hitching post out front. The marshal proved to be a stocky man named Porter, who was very pleased to see the Garrett gang in custody. He took charge of the prisoners immediately, locking them in cells and promising they would face trial for their crimes. "There is a reward for these three," Marshal Porter said, counting out bills from a strongbox. $200 to be split between you. Thomas and Jack divided the money, and Jack immediately tried to give his share to Faith. "You lost more than I did, miss. Take it to help you get started again." But Faith refused. "You earned it by catching them. I will not take your money, Mr. Winters." Jack grumbled, but eventually pocketed the bills, then announced he was heading to the saloon for a proper drink and a hot meal. He shook Thomas's hand, tipped his hat to Faith, and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Faith and Thomas stood together in the cold street, suddenly awkward now that their shared purpose had ended. The marshal had already gone back inside, and they were alone with too many unspoken things hanging between them. "I should help you find a place to stay," Thomas said finally. "There is a boarding house at the end of the street. It is clean and respectable." "That would be good," Faith said, though her heart was sinking. This was goodbye then. Tomorrow she would continue to Leadville, and Thomas would return to his mountains, and they would never see each other again. Thomas walked her to the boarding house, a tidy building run by an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson. He paid for a week's lodging before Faith could protest, pressing the money into the widow's hand with a firmness that brooked no argument. "You will need time to figure out your next steps," he said when Faith tried to object. "Consider it repayment for the coffee you made this morning." They stood in the boarding house parlor, and Faith searched desperately for words to express everything she felt. Thank you seemed woefully inadequate. Stay seemed impossibly presumptuous. "I love you is out of the question. I will never forget what you have done for me," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion she could not quite hide. "You saved my life, Thomas Sterling. I owe you everything." Thomas looked uncomfortable with the praise. He shifted his weight, his hat in his hands, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "You do not owe me anything. I just did what anyone decent would do." "You did more than that, and you know it," Faith said. She reached out and took his hand, holding it between both of hers. "Will you at least let me buy you dinner, as a proper thank you?" Thomas hesitated, and Faith held her breath. If he said no, if he walked out that door right now, she did not know how she would bear it. "Dinner would be nice," he said finally, and Faith's heart soared. They walked to the hotel dining room, one of the few establishments in Granite that served meals to women. The room was warm and bright, with oil lamps hanging from the ceiling and the smell of beef stew filling the air. Thomas ordered for both of them, and they sat across from each other at a small corner table. The meal was simple but good, and gradually the awkwardness eased as they talked. Thomas told her about his years working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, about learning to track and trap from an old mountain man in Wyoming, about the satisfaction of living by his own skills and wits. Faith told him about growing up in a store, about learning to sew because her mother insisted every woman should have a trade, about her father's dreams and her mother's quiet strength. The more they talked, the more Faith realized how much they had in common, despite their different paths. They had both lost parents too young, both learned to be self-sufficient out of necessity, both carried scars from a hard world that did not offer much mercy, but they had both also held on to something essential and good, a core of kindness and decency that suffering had not managed to extinguish. Over dessert, a surprisingly good apple pie, Thomas said carefully, "What will you do when you reach Leadville, after you find your brother?" I do not know, Faith admitted. Matthew and I will have to decide whether to try Working Father's claim or to sell it and move on. Neither of us really has our heart in silver mining, but we also do not have many other options. She traced patterns in the tablecloth with her fork. What about you? Will you stay in the mountains all winter? That was the plan, Thomas said. But I have been thinking maybe it is time for a change. I have spent 10 years moving from place to place, never putting down roots anywhere. Maybe it is time to find somewhere to belong. Faith's heart beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. What would you do if you decided to settle somewhere? I have been thinking about starting a ranch, Thomas said. Nothing big, just a small place with good grass and water where I could raise horses. I always liked working with horses better than cattle anyway. They have more sense and better temperaments. That sounds wonderful, Faith said sincerely. Where would you start this ranch? Thomas met her eyes across the table. I have been thinking maybe Kansas. I passed through the Flint Hills once years ago, and I never forgot how beautiful the land was. Rolling prairie as far as you could see, grass tall enough to brush a horse's belly. It seemed like a good place to build something that would last. Kansas. Faith's home, or at least where home had been before her father had uprooted them. The Flint Hills were only a few days' ride from El Dorado. If Thomas started a ranch there, and if Faith and Matthew decided not to stay in Colorado, they would be in the same part of the country. The possibility unfurled in her mind like a flower opening to the sun. But before she could respond, Thomas continued, his words coming faster as if he had to get them out before he lost his nerve. The thing is, a ranch is a lot of work for one person. It would be easier, better even, with a partner. Someone who knows how to keep accounts and manage supplies. Someone who is not afraid of hard work and knows how to make something from nothing. Faith's breath caught. Are you asking what I think you are asking? Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. I know we have only known each other for 2 days. I know it is crazy to feel this way so quickly. But Faith, you are the first person in 10 years who has made me want to stop running, who has made me think about building something permanent instead of just surviving from one season to the next. He tightened his grip on her hand. I am not good with words, and I do not have much to offer except a strong back and a willingness to work myself to the bone to give you a good life. But if you would consider it, I would be honored if you would come to Kansas with me, as my wife. Tears filled Faith's eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Sterling. Thomas stood and pulled her to her feet, and right there in the hotel dining room, in front of a dozen curious onlookers, he kissed her. It was not a practiced kiss or a smooth one, but it was heartfelt and genuine, and it made Faith feel like she had finally found the home she had been searching for without even knowing it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. We will do it right, he promised. We will find a preacher tomorrow, get properly married before we do anything else. And then we will go to Leadville together, find your brother, and figure out what comes next. Together. Together, Faith agreed, and the word had never sounded so beautiful. They were married the next morning by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Granite. Mrs. Patterson and Marshall Porter served as witnesses, both beaming with approval at the match. Faith wore her traveling dress, mended and cleaned as best she could manage, and Thomas bought her a simple gold band from the general store. It was not the wedding she might have dreamed of as a girl, but it was perfect nonetheless, because Thomas was looking at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. After the ceremony, they outfitted themselves properly for the journey to Leadville. Thomas sold his furs to the trading post, and with that money, plus the reward money, they bought a second horse for Faith, supplies for the journey, and warmer clothes for them both. Faith sent a telegram to her brother, warning him they were coming and hinting at her changed circumstances. The ride to Leadville took 4 days through increasingly rugged terrain. They traveled slowly, stopping early each afternoon to make camp and sitting close by the fire as darkness fell. Thomas proved to be a gentle and patient husband, waiting until Faith was ready before consummating their marriage on the 3rd night, in a quiet camp under a sky blazing with stars. It was awkward and tender and wonderful, and when Faith fell asleep afterward in Thomas's arms, she felt complete in a way she never had before. Matthew Coleman was waiting at the mining camp when they arrived, a lean young man of 22 who looked like he had been living hard. His eyes widened in shock when Faith introduced Thomas as her husband, but after the initial surprise wore off, he welcomed Thomas warmly and listened with increasing amazement to the story of the past week. The three of them spent 2 days assessing the silver claim. Thomas examined the mine shaft and the surrounding geology, and his verdict was frank. There might be silver here, but it would take more money and manpower than you have to find out. The rock is hard, and you would need to dig much deeper before you could be sure. It is a gamble, and not a good one. Matthew looked relieved rather than disappointed. I was starting to think the same thing. I have been breaking my back here for 6 months, with almost nothing to show for it. Father's dream is not my dream, and I am not going to kill myself chasing it. They decided to sell the claim to a mining company that had been sniffing around for months, offering to buy up small claims to consolidate their holdings. The price was not generous, but it was enough to give Matthew a fresh start and contribute to Faith and Thomas's ranch plans. With business concluded, they left Leadville in early December, heading east toward Kansas. Winter was deepening in the high country, and they were all eager to reach lower elevations before the serious snow set in. Matthew rode with them, still uncertain about his future, but willing to help establish the ranch while he figured out what he wanted to do next. The journey took nearly 3 weeks, pushing hard through mountain passes and across the plains. They spent Christmas in a small town in eastern Colorado, celebrating in a humble hotel room with store-bought pie and a sense of profound gratitude for having survived the year and found each other. They reached the Flint Hills in early January of 1883, riding into a landscape of rolling prairie that stretched endlessly under a pale winter sky. The grass was yellow now, dormant until spring. But even in winter's grip, Faith could see the beauty Thomas had described. This was good land, honest land, the kind of place where a person could build something lasting. Thomas used his money and Faith's earnings from Denver to purchase a quarter section along a creek that ran year-round. There was a small soddy already built on the property, rough but weatherproof. That would serve as their home while they built something better. They moved in immediately, and Matthew helped Thomas start planning fences and corrals and a barn. The first winter was hard. They lived in close quarters in the soddy, working dawn to dusk to improve the property, preparing for the spring, when Thomas wanted to buy his first horses. Money was tight, and the work was backbreaking, but Faith had never been happier. She fell asleep each night in Thomas's arms, warm despite the cold outside, secure despite their uncertain finances, content in a way she had never imagined possible. Matthew left in March, heading back to El Dorado, where he had decided to open a hardware store. Faith was sad to see him go, but proud of him for finding his own path. He promised to visit often, and Thomas promised the same. Spring brought green grass and wildflowers, and the arrival of Thomas's first horses, a small herd of half-wild Mustangs he purchased from a rancher in the eastern part of the state. Faith watched him work with them, gentle and patient, earning their trust over weeks and months until they would come to his call and stand quiet under saddle. He had a gift with horses, a natural understanding of their minds and hearts, and word began to spread that Thomas Sterling sold quality animals properly trained. Summer brought heat and thunderstorms, and Faith's discovery that she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch of their new house, a proper wooden structure with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above that Thomas had spent the spring building. "A baby?" Thomas breathed, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "Are you certain?" "Quite certain," Faith said, smiling at his expression of wonder and fear. "Come spring, you are going to be a father." Thomas pulled her close, holding her like she was made of glass. "I never thought I would have this," he said quietly. "A wife, a home, a family. I thought I would spend my whole life alone, and now I have everything." "We have everything," Faith corrected, and kissed him as the sun set over the prairie. Their daughter was born in early April of 1884, delivered by a midwife from the nearest town, with Thomas pacing anxiously outside. They named her Rose, after Thomas's mother, and she had Faith's dark hair and Thomas's gray eyes. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, gentle and patient with the tiny person who had entered their lives. The years flowed past, marked by the rhythm of seasons and the steady growth of their ranch. Thomas's reputation as a horseman grew, and buyers came from across Kansas and beyond to purchase his well-trained animals. Faith managed the accounts and correspondence, her sewing skills from Denver, forgotten in favor of ranch work and raising children. Rose was joined by a son, James, 2 years later, and then another daughter, Catherine, 2 years after that. The house was expanded to accommodate the growing family, and the ranch itself grew, adding more land and more horses as prosperity allowed. Matthew visited often from El Dorado, and eventually he brought a wife, a sweet-natured woman named Sarah, who became Faith's close friend. Life was not always easy. There were dry summers and harsh winters, illness and injury, the constant challenges of running a ranch and raising a family on the frontier. But through it all, Faith and Thomas stood together, their love deepening and strengthening with each passing year. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Faith riding across the prairie they now called home. It was a beautiful spring evening, the grass green and tall, wildflowers blooming in abundance. They rode to the top of a hill where they could see for miles in every direction, and Thomas helped Faith dismount. "Do you remember when I first asked you to marry me?" he said, holding her hands. "I told you I did not have much to offer except hard work and determination." "I remember," Faith said, smiling, "and I said yes anyway, because I loved you even then." "I have been thinking about how much has changed since that day," Thomas continued. "We have this ranch, these children, this whole life we have built together. But the thing I am most grateful for, the thing I treasure above everything else, is that you are still here beside me, that you still choose me every single day." Faith reached up to cup his face. "Choosing you was the easiest decision I ever made, Thomas Sterling. You knelt down and lit my fire when I was shaking too hard to do it myself, and you have been keeping me warm ever since." Thomas kissed her there on the hilltop, with the prairie wind sighing around them and the sun painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. When they finally pulled apart, they stood together looking out over the land they had claimed and the life they had created. Far in the distance, Faith could see their house with smoke rising from the chimney. She could see the corrals where their horses grazed peacefully. She could imagine their children inside, probably being watched by Matthew and Sarah, who had come for the anniversary celebration. Everything she loved, everything that mattered, was contained in that view. "We should head back," Thomas said eventually. "The children will be getting hungry." "In a minute," Faith said, leaning against him. "I just want to stay here a little longer, with you." So, they stood together as the light faded, two people who had found each other in the midst of wilderness and danger, who had built something beautiful from kindness and courage and love. The journey from that cold Colorado morning to this peaceful Kansas evening had been long and difficult, but Faith would not have changed a single step of it, because every road, no matter how hard, was worth traveling if it led you home. And Thomas Sterling, the gentle cowboy who had knelt down to light her fire, had given her that. He had given her everything. The years continued to unfold with a gentle rhythm that Faith had learned to treasure. By 1890, Rose was 6 years old and already showing signs of her father's gift with horses. She spent hours in the corrals, watching Thomas work and imitating his soft, patient manner. James was 4, rambunctious and adventurous, always climbing something or chasing the ranch dogs. Catherine was just learning to walk, tottering around on chubby legs and laughing at everything. Thomas had built their ranch into one of the most respected operations in the Flint Hills. His horses were known throughout Kansas and into Missouri for their steady temperaments and excellent training. Faith handled the business side, corresponding with buyers, managing accounts, and ensuring that the ranch remained profitable even in difficult years. Together, they were an efficient team, complementing each other's strengths and supporting each other through weaknesses. The local community had grown around them as well. More families had moved into the area, drawn by good land and the promise of making honest livings. A school had been established 3 miles from their ranch, and Rose had just started attending, riding there each morning on a gentle mare Thomas had trained specifically for her. A church had been built as well, and Faith served on the ladies' auxiliary, organizing socials and helping new families get established. Life had settled into a comfortable pattern, but Faith never forgot those desperate moments in the Colorado mountains when her world had seemed to be ending. On cold mornings when she built up the fire in their cook stove, she remembered shaking so hard she could not light a match. And she remembered strong, calloused hands taking the matches from her and coaxing flame to life with patient determination. That memory made her appreciate everything they had built even more. Their love had been forged in crisis and tested by hardship, and it had only grown stronger. Thomas was not just her husband, but her partner in every sense, the person she trusted absolutely and loved without reservation. Sometimes, late at night, when the children were asleep and they lay together in the darkness, Faith would tell Thomas about her fears from those early days. How she had been so terrified, so alone, so certain that she would die on that frozen mountainside. And Thomas would hold her close and remind her that she had survived, that they both had, and that everything they had now was built on that foundation of survival and mutual support. "We are stronger together than we ever could have been apart," he would say, and Faith knew it was true. In the summer of 1892, Matthew and Sarah had their first child, a boy they named Henry after their father. Faith traveled to El Dorado for the birth, bringing Rose and Catherine with her, while Thomas stayed home with James to manage the ranch. Holding her nephew for the first time, Faith was overwhelmed with gratitude for the family that had survived so much loss and found a way to continue. Matthew looked exhausted but happy, his hardware store thriving and his family growing. Over dinner one evening during Faith's visit, he raised a glass of lemonade and a toast. "To Father," he said. "His dream of striking it rich in silver never came true, but he gave us something better. He taught us to take risks, to believe in possibilities, to keep moving forward even when things were hard. Without his example, I would never have had the courage to start my own business, and you would never have survived that journey to Leadville." He looked at Faith with deep affection. "And you would never have met Thomas." Faith felt tears prick her eyes. "To Father," she echoed, "and to Mother, who taught us that love is worth any sacrifice." They clinked glasses, and Faith felt the presence of her parents almost tangibly, as if they were watching over their children and grandchildren with approval and pride. The visit to El Dorado lasted 2 weeks, and when Faith returned home with her daughters, Thomas met them at the door with James on his shoulders and a smile that made Faith's heart skip, just like it had the first time she saw him. "I missed you," he said simply, pulling her close after James had scrambled down to hug his sisters. "I missed you too," Faith said, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and horses and open sky. "But I am glad Matthew is happy. Glad we all survived to build these lives." That evening, after the children were in bed, Thomas and Faith sat on their porch watching fireflies dance over the prairie grass. The night was warm, the stars brilliant overhead, and Faith felt a profound sense of peace. "Do you ever think about that morning in the mountains?" she asked. "When you found me?" "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "I think about how easily I could have ridden a different direction. How I almost did not investigate those gunshots because I thought it might be hunters. How close we came to never meeting at all." "Fate," Faith said softly. "Maybe," Thomas agreed. "Or maybe just luck. But whatever it was, I am grateful for it every single day." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the darkness deepen. Faith thought about all the moments that had led them to this place, this life, the loss and fear and desperate uncertainty that had marked her journey west. The kindness of a stranger who had become everything. The hard work and determination that had built a ranch and a family from nothing but hope and love. It was not the life her father had dreamed of when he sold his store in El Dorado and headed for the silver fields. There was no great fortune, no striking it rich, no dramatic transformation of circumstances. But in its own way, Faith thought, what she and Thomas had built was more valuable than any amount of silver. They had created a home where love was abundant and certain. They had raised children who knew they were wanted and cherished. They had established a business built on honest work and fair dealing. They had become part of a community where they contributed and belonged, and most importantly, they had found in each other a partnership that made everything possible. When Faith was weak, Thomas was strong. When Thomas doubted himself, Faith believed in him. They balanced and completed each other, two halves of a whole that neither could have imagined before that cold Colorado morning. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, sensing her contemplative mood. "Everything," Faith said. "How we got here, how lucky we are, how much I love you." Thomas squeezed her hand. "I love you too, more than words can express. You are my heart, Faith. You always will be." The years marched on, bringing with them the joys and sorrows inherent to any life. Rose grew into a beautiful young woman who inherited her father's gift with horses and her mother's head for business. At 18, she married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man named William Turner, who treated her with respect and adoration. The wedding was held at the Sterling Ranch, with half the county in attendance, and Matthew officiating since he had been ordained as a lay minister. James proved more restless than his sisters, eventually leaving Kansas to try his luck in Montana, working on a massive cattle ranch and sending regular letters home describing the wild country and his adventures. Faith worried about him, but Thomas reminded her that young men needed to find their own paths, just as he had done at that age. Catherine, the youngest, surprised everyone by developing a passion for teaching. She attended the normal school in Emporia and returned to their district as a schoolteacher, living at home and riding to the schoolhouse each morning, just as Rose had done years before. Thomas and Faith aged gracefully together, their hair graying, but their health remaining good, thanks to active lives and clean living. The ranch continued to prosper, though they gradually turned over more of the daily operation to Rose and William, who had moved into a house they built on Sterling property. On Faith's 40th birthday in 1896, Thomas surprised her with a trip back to Colorado. They traveled by train now, a luxury unimaginable during their first journey, and stayed in a hotel in Denver. Thomas hired a guide and horses, and they rode up into the mountains, searching for the place where they had met. It took 2 days of searching, but finally they found it. The hollow where Thomas had made his camp was still there, identifiable by the creek and the configuration of pine trees. The tent was long gone, of course, but the fire pit remained, a circle of stones slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Faith stood in that spot, remembering with perfect clarity the terror and desperation she had felt. And she remembered the sound of hoofbeats, the gentle voice calling out, the strong hands that had taken matches from her shaking fingers and brought fire and safety to life. "I was so scared," she said softly. Thomas stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist. "I know. I could see it in every line of your body. That is why I knew I had to help." "You did more than help," Faith said, turning in his arms to look up at him. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and then you gave me a life beyond anything I could have dreamed." They made love that night in their hotel room, their passion tempered by years, but deepened by profound intimacy and knowledge of each other. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Thomas's heartbeat steady under her ear, Faith felt complete in a way that transcended physical satisfaction. This was belonging. This was home. Not a place but a person, someone whose presence made her whole. They returned to Kansas a week later, and life resumed its comfortable rhythm. Grandchildren began to arrive. First Rose and William's son, Thomas Jr., then their daughter Eleanor, then more as the years passed. James eventually returned from Montana with a wife, a capable frontier woman named Clara, and they settled on a piece of Sterling land to start their own horse operation in partnership with the family business. Catherine married a doctor from Emporia when she was 25, and they built a life together in town, though she visited the ranch often with her own growing family. As the 19th century drew to a close and the new century dawned, Thomas and Faith Sterling could look around and see their legacy spreading across the Flint Hills. Their children and grandchildren, their horses and land, their reputation for integrity and quality, all of it was testament to what two people could build when they faced the world together with love and determination. In the spring of 1905, on their 22nd anniversary, Thomas took Faith riding again, just as he had done on their 10th anniversary. They were in their 50s now, their bodies not as strong as they had once been, but still capable, still vital. They rode to the same hilltop, dismounted, and stood looking out over the ranch that had grown beyond their wildest early dreams. "Do you remember what you said last time we were here?" Thomas asked. Faith smiled. "I said you had been keeping me warm ever since you lit my fire that morning in Colorado." "You did," Thomas confirmed. And it made me think about how true that was, how the warmth we create together is not just physical, but emotional, spiritual, how we keep each other's hearts warm even when the world is cold. "It is still true," Faith said, "even more true now, after all these years." Thomas pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a small flame-shaped pendant set with a single ruby. "I had this made for you," he said, "to commemorate that moment when everything changed. The flame represents the fire I lit, but also the fire of love that has burned between us ever since. I wanted you to have something to remember, that we started with nothing but kindness and courage, and we built everything." Faith's eyes filled with tears as Thomas fastened the necklace around her throat. She touched the pendant, feeling the smoothness of the gold and the slight roughness of the ruby setting. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "I will treasure it always." They held each other as the sun began to set, painting the sky in glorious shades of pink and orange. In the distance, they could see Rose and William working horses in the corral. Smoke rose from Catherine's house, where she was probably cooking dinner for her family. Even James's distant spread was visible, a dark cluster of buildings on the horizon. Everything they loved was contained in that view, everything they had worked for and dreamed of and built with their own hands and hearts. "We did well," Thomas said quietly. "We did more than well," Faith corrected. "We did something remarkable. We took the worst moments of our lives and transformed them into something beautiful." As darkness fell, they rode slowly home, where their family would be gathering for the anniversary celebration. There would be food and laughter, grandchildren running and playing, stories told and retold about the early days when times were hard, but hope was abundant. And through it all, Faith would wear her new necklace, the little golden flame resting against her heart, a reminder of a cold morning, a gentle cowboy, and the simple act of kindness that had changed everything. The years after 1905 brought changes as the modern age crept into even remote corners of Kansas. Automobiles began to appear on roads that had once known only horses and wagons. Telephones connected ranches and towns that had been isolated. The world was shrinking, becoming faster and more connected. But at the Sterling Ranch, some things remained constant. Thomas still rose before dawn to check on his horses, moving more slowly now, but with the same patience and care. Faith still managed the books and correspondence, her hair completely white now, but her mind sharp as ever. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the prairie and talking about everything and nothing. In 1910, they celebrated their silver anniversary with a party that drew family and friends from across the state. Matthew traveled from El Dorado with Sarah and their grown children. All three of Thomas and Faith's children were there with their spouses and the growing gaggle of grandchildren. The governor of Kansas even sent a congratulatory telegram acknowledging Thomas Sterling's contributions to horse breeding in the state. During the party, Rose stood to make a speech. At 32, she was a confident woman, a successful rancher in her own right, and clearly her parents' daughter. "I want to tell you all a story," she said, quieting the crowd. "When I was little, maybe 6 years old, I asked my mother how she and my father met. She told me about being alone in the mountains, frightened and cold, unable even to light a fire because she was shaking so badly. And she told me how my father came along, knelt down, and lit that fire for her." Rose looked at her parents with obvious affection. "Even as a child, I understood that story was about more than just a fire. It was about two people who saw each other in moments of need and chose to reach out. My father gave my mother warmth and safety. My mother gave my father purpose and love. And from that single act of kindness grew this entire family, this ranch, this legacy we all share." She raised her glass. "So I propose a toast to Thomas and Faith Sterling, who taught us all that the greatest things in life come from the simplest acts of compassion. May their example guide us always." "Here, here," the crowd chorused, and Faith found herself crying happy tears while Thomas held her hand and looked profoundly moved. Later that night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Faith and Thomas sat alone by the dying embers of the bonfire that had been built for the celebration. Faith still wore the flame necklace Thomas had given her 5 years earlier, and she touched it absently as she leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Rose is right, you know," she said. "Everything we have came from that moment when you chose to help me." "No," Thomas disagreed gently. "Everything we have came from both of us choosing, every day, to build something together. That morning in the mountains was just the beginning, the real work, the real creation that came from 25 years of choosing each other again and again." Faith considered that. "You are right. Love is not a single moment, but 1,000 daily choices to stay, to work, to forgive, to hope." "Exactly," Thomas said. He kissed the top of her head. "And I choose you, Faith Sterling, every day for the rest of my life, however long that may be." "And I choose you," Faith whispered. They sat together until the fire burned down to ash, then walked hand in hand to their house, the home they had built together through years of labor and love. Thomas Sterling passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1918, at the age of 61. He died as he had lived, with dignity and without complaint, his hand held by Faith and his family surrounding his bed. His last words were, "I have no regrets. It was all worth it." Faith mourned him deeply, but not desperately. She had been blessed with 36 years of marriage to a good man, and she had enough memories to sustain her through however many years remained. She wore black for a year, as was proper, and then resumed her life with the quiet determination Thomas had always admired. She lived another 12 years, watching her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren arrive. The ranch continued to prosper under Rose and William's management, and Thomas Jr. proved to have his grandfather's gift with horses. Faith remained active and engaged, a beloved matriarch whose wisdom was sought on everything from business decisions to family disputes. On April 10, 1930, Faith Coleman Sterling died at the age of 73, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch she had shared with Thomas for so many years. She was found by Catherine, who had come to visit, with a peaceful expression on her face and the flame necklace clutched in her hand. Her funeral drew hundreds of people from across Kansas and beyond. The Sterling family had touched countless lives through their business and their community involvement, and people came to pay their respects to the woman who had built so much from so little. Rose spoke at the funeral, her voice strong despite her grief. "My mother taught me that strength comes in many forms, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. That kindness is never wasted, and that love, real love, transforms everything it touches." She held up the flame necklace that would now pass to her own daughter. "This necklace tells my parents' story. A cowboy knelt down and lit a fire for a woman who was shaking too hard to light it herself. That simple act of compassion became a love story that lasted 4 decades and created a legacy that will endure for generations." Faith was buried beside Thomas on a gentle rise overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names, dates, and a single inscription that Rose had chosen. Together, they built something beautiful. The Sterling Ranch continued for many years after Faith's death, passed down through generations who remembered and honored the couple who had started it all. The story of that cold morning in the Colorado mountains became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren as an example of how great things can grow from small kindnesses. Even today, more than a century later, descendants of Thomas and Faith Sterling live in the Flint Hills, working land that their ancestors claimed with nothing but determination and love. The original house still stands, preserved and maintained as a reminder of where it all began. And sometimes, in the evenings when the light is just right, you can almost see them, a man and a woman sitting together on the porch, watching the prairie they tamed and loved, holding hands as the sun sets over the land they made home. 2 people who found each other in the wilderness and built something that would outlast them both. The fire Thomas lit on that cold November morning in 1882 never truly went out. It transformed into something greater, a warmth that spread across generations, a light that guided a family through joys and sorrows alike. And at its heart was always the same simple truth that Faith had recognized from the very beginning. Love, real and enduring love, makes everything possible. Their story proves that the greatest adventures do not always involve grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though those played their part. Sometimes the greatest adventures come from choosing to be kind when you could be indifferent, from extending your hand when you could walk away, from building something lasting when it would be easier to keep moving. Thomas Sterling knelt down and lit a fire for Faith Coleman when she was shaking too hard to light it herself. And from that fire, they forged a love that warmed them through 36 years of marriage, sustained their children and grandchildren, and left a legacy that endures to this day. It is a reminder that we never know which small choice might change everything, which moment of kindness might transform not just one life, but dozens, even hundreds, which spark might grow into a flame that burns across generations. In the end, that is what love truly is. Not the thunderbolt of first attraction, though that has its place. Not the passion of new romance, though that too is important. But rather, love is the daily choice to tend the fire, to add fuel when it burns low, to shelter it from winds that would extinguish it, and to share its warmth freely with those around you. Thomas and Faith Sterling understood that truth. They lived it every day of their marriage. And because they did, they left behind not just a successful ranch or a large family, but a legacy of love that continues to warm hearts and inspire souls more than a century after that cold Colorado morning when everything began. Their story ends not with death, but with continuation, with great-great-grandchildren who carry their blood and their values, with a ranch that still bears their name and upholds their standards, with a memory that reminds everyone who hears it that kindness matters, that love endures, and that the simplest gesture can change the world. On quiet evenings in the Flint Hills, when the wind whispers through the tall grass and the stars come out one by one, the spirit of Thomas and Faith Sterling still lingers, not as ghosts, but as a presence, a reminder of what was built here and why it matters. They created home from wilderness, family from loneliness, and legacy from a single moment when one person chose to help another. That is their gift to the future. That is what they left behind. And it is enough, more than enough. It is everything.